Everybody, welcome to chapter 26. Today we're going to talk about business cycles. So, we're going to define the business cycle and what it looks like. Typically, I think of it as a roller coaster, the continual up down of economic activity. So, over the course of economic history, there have been two major fluctuations. The Great Depression was our largest period of economic decline, and then there's the post World War II boom. So there are four phases of the business cycle: expansion, peak, contraction, trough. And then it just repeats from there: expansion, peak, contraction, trough. Expansion is our period of growth, economic growth. We're going to see output increasing, so GDP is increasing, income and employment are going up. So during this time, unemployment's falling. We get to our peak, which is our highest point. This is when we've reached our temporary maximum. And at this point, unemployment's at its lowest, GDP is at its highest. It's close to our capacity, what we're able to produce. And the one problem that we can get here is we might start to see some inflation. Then we hit contraction, which is our period of decline. Total output, real GDP is falling, unemployment's rising, and we start to see prices rise at a much slower rate. Then our trough is our temporary low point. GDP stops falling, unemployment's at its highest, and unemployment or output's at its lowest. And then when that's over, we hit expansion again. The Bureau of Economic Research has said that there have been 33 business cycles from 1854 to 2009. Typically, they last about 55 months, though in recent history, they've been longer. So let's talk about problems with the business cycle and what is a secular trend. So there are a few problems that come with the business cycle, and the first one is probably the most common, which is a recession. This is a prolonged economic contraction. All that means is when GDP falls for 2 quarters or 6 months in a row, it's considered a recession. What we see during a recession, output is falling, so unemployment's going up, there are less people having jobs, businesses aren't investing as much money since they don't need to expand as much with falling demand, and we start to see unemployment go up. Here you can see graphically the recession of 2000 to 2001 was relatively short. GDP fell for 3 quarters, but under the definition, 2 quarters in a row, it was a recession. A depression is one of these ambiguous economic terms, and it just means a prolonged and severe recession. Who decides when a recession becomes a depression? Typically, you're going to see people not want to call something a depression because that makes people nervous. And a lot of what's going on in the economy depends how people feel. And when you call something a depression, people get scared. And when people get scared, they stop spending money and they start saving more. And that can be difficult in times where we need people to spend money to get us out of a depression or a recession. Typically, we see unemployment above 10%, output's really low, and it can cause some long term problems. It took 9 years for our economy to rebound to where we were before the Great Depression. So it was a long term recovery, and a lot of it was kind of spurred by the war. The next problem is inflation and deflation. Inflation is an increase in the general level of prices. So at any given time in an economy, prices of some things might be going up, but prices of other things might be going down. But overall, if prices in the economy are increasing, that's considered inflation. Deflation is when prices in the economy are falling overall. And I know some of you are thinking, Ms. Ingberg, why is that bad? Well, we think like consumers, and we think, yeah, lower prices, that sounds great. But what happens is we get into what's called the deflationary spiral. And when prices are lower, businesses aren't making as much money. And when businesses don't make as much money, some of them can't sustain that and they start to default on their debts. They start to not be able to pay some of their bills, and some of them are going to go bankrupt. And either one of those things leads to layoffs of workers and wage reductions, people working for less because the businesses can't afford to pay them. And when that happens, less people are making money, so demand falls. And when demand falls, prices fall. And when prices fall, we get businesses that aren't making as much money and they start to default on their debts. And you see how it just kind of continues to spiral downward. And then the worst thing we can have in economics is what's called stagflation. This is simultaneous high prices, inflation, and unemployment. Falling output and rising prices cause big issues in an economy. You have less people working, so they're not making money, and yet prices are going up. This was a big problem in the 70s. It comes from falling supply. When supply falls, shifts to the left. Our output right down here, our real GDP is falling, but yet at the same time, prices are increasing. So in this case, in the 70s, it was a result of oil supply shortage. And oil was an input, so that price went up, so supply decreased, causing price to increase. Output was falling, jobs were falling. We get stagflation. Although all business cycles pass through the same expansion peak, contraction trough, expansion peak, contraction trough, uh, there have been some big outliers of prolonged expansion or peak or contraction. Great Depression, we had 27% decline in real GDP over 3 years, and it really hurt business activity for over 10 years. In comparison to that, in all of our recent recessions, they've been pretty minor. GDP falling by at most 3.7%. And a lot of people argued that's why the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, even though long, didn't meet the requirements for what people thought of as a depression because output didn't fall by that much. The Great Recession was our worst financial and economic crisis since the Great Depression in the 30s. It was triggered by a decline in housing prices. It started with mortgage loans and financial securities that were built on the mortgage loans, and we'll talk more about that in depth in a later chapter. But it basically created the same issues of a major contraction of output falling, unemployment rising, in this case to just over 10%, and it took us a while to recover. Here you can see that period of recession graphically. It had the largest increase in unemployment since World War II, not the highest level. You can see in the 80s we got a little bit higher, but just the increase from where we were to that just over 10%. Our secular trend is basically the idea of if we kind of drew a line through all business cycles, what would the trend line look like? And in our economy, it has been one of growth. You can see here over time different business cycles. You can see our GDP, or in this graph, GNP, has been increasing over time pretty substantially. So let's talk about why business cycles occur and what is the impact on different industries. Well, the basic reason that business cycles occur changes the fluctuations. It has to do with shocks, unexpected events or situations. And then it leads to individuals and firms needing to adjust. So what causes these shocks? First off, major innovation. This typically is going to spur a period of expansion. The reason that we call this a shock is we don't know when the next major innovation is going to happen. They happen irregularly and unexpectedly, and when they do happen, it tends to be really good for the economy. Productivity changes. Unexpected changes in productivity are output per unit of input. If it unexpectedly increases, something happens, and all of a sudden we become more productive, we tend to see economic expansion. If something happens and productivity unexpectedly falls, the economy is going to go into a recession. Changes in the money supply. The money supply is controlled by our nation's central bank. And if they put out more money than people are expecting, more money, more spending, we tend to see inflation and economic increase. Um, if they put out less money than people were expecting, we can then see economic decline, decline in output and employment. This one probably rings true more than any other ones right now. Political and random events. This is typically what we think of as wars, but I will also throw out there pandemics. Um, this coronavirus came up and it is having global consequences that are going to affect the economy for years to come. And we will see what that is. Financial instability, unexpected financial bubbles, which is a rising prices of an asset quickly, or a burst where price decreases rapidly, uh, can spill over into the economy. It's what we call booms and busts, which we will talk more about. All of this comes down to these unexpected events changing our total level of spending. And if there's an unexpected increase in our total level of spending, we tend to see more economic expansion. If total spending unexpectedly falls and firms can't lower prices, we're going to see output fall and we tend to be in contraction. Slower sales, they cut back on production, GDP falls, fewer workers will be needed, so unemployment rises, and we can contract or enter a recession. Flip side, we spend more money, output, employment, and income might rise. This impacts different sectors of our economy differently, different industries. So I want to talk a little bit about the durable good industry. Remember, durable goods are those goods that are expected to last longer than 3 years. Within limits, households and firms can postpone their purchases of durable goods, or firms can, postpone their purchases of capital goods. So in an economic expansion, we tend to buy durable goods more often than we need to. And during times of economic decline, we tend to put those purchases off. If your washer breaks and we're in a contraction of the economy, most people aren't like, oh, I'm going to just run out and buy a new washer. You hire somebody to fix it. You try to make it last as long as possible. And businesses do the same things with their machines. In times of recession, they're going to try to fix them, make them last long as they can. In times of expansion, they tend to replace them and add new ones faster than maybe necessary. On the other two sectors of our economy, in the consumption part of our economy, services and non-durables, they're pretty much isolated from these events. No matter what's going on, people still need medical services. They still need legal services. They still need food and clothing, and those things that are used up. They're not as easy to postpone. So these industries tend to be a little bit more isolated from business cycle fluctuations.